Tonight on Greater Boston, after another day in the hot seat for Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson, fielding questions and attacks from Republicans in the Senate Judiciary Committee, I'm joined by law professor Njeri Rutledge, who studied at Harvard Law School with Judge Jackson and was at today's hearing. And later, Suffolk County District Attorney candidate, Boston City Councilor Ricardo Arroyo, he'll make his case to be the cities of Boston, Revere, Winthrop, and Chelsea's top prosecutor. And finally, State Representative Tram Nguyen and Leverett Wing, President and CEO of the Commonwealth Seminar, on what we should be doing to protect Asian American communities a year after the Atlanta spa killings. It's been a full day and soon a full night of Senate questioning for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, who, if confirmed, as you know, will be the first black woman on the Supreme Court. But with Democrats clearly having the votes to get her through, for Republicans, today was less about her considerable qualifications. Harvard Law School grad who served as a federal district, an appellate court judge, public defender, member of the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and more about scoring political points and, I guess, settling old scores.
What faith are you, by the way? Could you fairly judge a Catholic? Well, how would you feel if a senator up here said, your faith, a dogma, lives loudly within you, and that's of concern? How would you feel if somebody up here on our side said, you know, you attend church too much for me, or your faith is a little bit different to me, and they would suggest that it would affect your decision? Would you find that offensive?
Senator,
I would if I were you. I found it offensive when they said it about Judge Barrett.
Critical race theory frames all of society as a fundamental and intractable battle between the races. It views every conflict as a racial conflict. Do you think that's an accurate way of viewing society in the world we live in?
Senator, I don't think so.
Is critical race theory taught in schools? Is it taught kindergarten through 12th?
Senator, I don't know. I don't think so. I believe it's an academic theory that's at the law school level.
But throughout, Judge Jackson made it clear she's not in this to play politics nor to set policy.
I am acutely aware that as a judge in our system, I have limited power. And I am trying in every case to stay in my lane.
Joined by Njeri Rutledge, she's a law professor at South Texas College of Law in Houston, who attended Harvard Law with Judge Jackson, who was at today's hearing. It's so good to see you again. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am so jealous that you were in the room yesterday and today, limited attendance. What's the atmosphere like at a moment like this when you're physically there?
The first day felt electric. It actually wasn't very crowded the first day. I think I was able to get in at 3 o'clock, which was the perfect timing because I got to hear Professor Lisa Fairfax's introduction. I went to law school with Lisa as well. Of course, Lisa is one of her roommates. And I got to hear Judge Jackson. And I have to say, once Judge Jackson raised her right hand and took the oath, I felt very emotional. Even though I've known this was going to happen, it really felt real, and the weight of it all was really quite moving.
You know, not surprisingly, every Democrat who I saw today during the 30 minutes was very supportive. How would you characterize the Republican line of questioning today? Very
disappointing.
Why?
I think despite the fact that they said they were going to do a fair hearing, and it wasn't going to be a circus, it seems like they have engaged in a smear campaign, calling Judge Jackson a defender of terrorists, and she is soft on crime and soft on child pornography and all of those ridiculous things. It's highly offensive because Judge Jackson is a mother. She has been a federal judge for over a decade, and she has a proven record of being fair, even-handed, and upholding the rule of law and the Constitution. And so all of those narratives. It was really a form of political theater, as if they're trying to rehearse for the midterms as they get ready to call all Democrats and all progressive prosecutors soft on crime. I think that's very disappointing and a disservice to the American people, because we can't know more about Judge Jackson if they're so busy settling old scores and trying to do their pre-campaign speeches.
You know, by the way, Chuck Todd from Meet the Press was on a radio show the other day and said, very in anticipation of this, said it's going to be like cross-examining Biden for the midterms. If they could blame Judge Jackson for inflation, they would do that too. And I'm going to leave what the insurrectionist supporter Hawley had to say yesterday about child pornography, because obviously his facts were completely BS. However, there was a lot of criticism of two Republican senators today asking the judge about using the term war criminals. And both times she said, referencing Rumsfeld and President Bush, both times she said she didn't recall the exact language. And while there's been a lot of criticism online for those questions, I looked it up. She did say in a brief that their actions constituted war crimes. So that's fair game, is it not? She's entitled to answer, and that's fact-based. They're entitled to ask, aren't they?
I think it is fair game, as long as it's not taken out of context.
Right.
You know, there's a difference between saying your actions are going to amount to war crimes versus you're a war criminal. And I think they tried to say that she called the president a war criminal.
Yes, they did.
Which is a little bit much. It's also a bit disingenuous in light of the way habeas corpus review worked during that time. You know, most of the time when people were released from Guantanamo Bay, it was because of the Department of Defense and the military tribunal. And so to try to put all of that on her shoulders and talk about recidivism and you're just letting them out so they can terrorize the country again is really a stretch and a mischaracterization. You
know, yesterday, Senator Blackburn brought up critical race theory and, again, misrepresented something that Judge Jackson had said in a speech about what she does, what she incorporates into her thinking when she is doing sentencing, suggesting critical race theory as part of it. You just heard, actually, your law school classmate, not only Judge Jackson, Ted Cruz, bringing up critical race theory again, taking it to the point that you know, did you know whether it's taught in grades X through Y? What was your reaction to that?
I don't know what the reaction is of the general American people.
How about
I was not in the room.
How about you, I'm asking?
Oh, I was outraged. I'm so tired of, you know, it's really quite brilliant how the Republicans can take a term and make it such a hot button issue, like critical race theory, like like assuming that everyone who's a Democrat is soft on crime. Critical race theory, as Judge Jackson accurately described, is something that we talked about in law school. It's not something that we're teaching in K through 12. In K through 12, we should be talking about history of all people, including Black history. But it's become such a hot button issue when Ted Cruz and Marsha Blackburn talk about critical race theory in a Supreme Court nomination hearing. They're just trying to talk to their constituents. That has nothing to do with Judge Jackson. Judge Jackson is not a politician. She's not responsible for policy. If they want to ask her about how she views the Constitution, that's fair game. But to talk about things like critical race theory, what's next? Gas prices?
Well, I have a feeling that gas prices were not really where they were going. I think it may have reflected their conundrum about the fact this is a Black woman. And while they all went out of their way to say how charming this Black woman was and how thrilled they were to meet her, there was also a question where the only other question I heard that was specifically, I thought, about race was when Senator Cornyn from Texas asked the question whether she celebrated when Clarence Thomas was nominated. And she paused and she said, "I believe I did." Were you surprised by that answer from the judge?
No, you know, Judge Clarence Thomas's nomination was very complicated for the Black community because he was replacing Justice Thurgood Marshall, just like Justice Amy Coney Barrett replaced Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah.
And they were totally different people. And so while I'm sure there was a part of everyone, and, you know, I actually have worked with people who know Justice Thomas personally, and they say really great things about him as an individual. And so, you know, he is an African-American judge with a different ideological background, and we are not a monolithic group. So for that and his achievements, of course you would celebrate him.
Well, I don't know if Anita Hill would agree about what a great person he is, but I was...
I'm not, and not just Anita Hill, there's several other people who
exactly, who didn't get to testify. Yeah.
But putting that aside, I think she has been on record by saying that she doesn't fully understand him. And I think that's true for many people.
You know, Njeri, one last thing. As you know, and I assume most viewers know, 3 Republicans voted for her for lower court nominations: Murkowski from Alaska, Collins from Maine, and Lindsey Graham. If Judge Jackson becomes a justice of the Supreme Court because of only Democratic votes, with the vice president, I think for the first time in history, casting the deciding vote, does that compromise her effectiveness, her credibility on the court?
It will not compromise her effectiveness or credibility. It will be seen as a slap in the face for a brilliant justice, a brilliant judge who is very qualified and who is very fair and who has received bipartisan congressional support on 3 separate occasions. Yes. For us to have to get to the point where Kamala Harris has to cast the deciding vote would be very bittersweet. In one sense, she's going to be the next Supreme Court justice regardless. On the other hand, how dare they deny this brilliant jurist the opportunity to be on the court? The stakes in many ways are low. They're going to keep their super conservative majority. She is qualified. She's been endorsed by the Fraternal Order of Police, yes, Republicans, Democrats. So I would find it very offensive and troubling if they just took the party line and said no.
Qualified she is. Njeri Rutledge, it's great to see you as always. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Next up, the Suffolk County District Attorney race is heating up. Boston City Councilor and former public defender Ricardo Arroyo announced his run last month, going up against interim District Attorney Kevin Hayden, who announced he'll be seeking a full term as well. Ricardo Arroyo joins me now. It's great to see you, Councilor. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Why do you think the voters of Suffolk County should fire interim DA Hayden and hire you?
I think we made a decision in 2017 as a county to move in a more progressive direction, one that addresses racial disparity and class disparity in our criminal justice system. And I think Rachel Rollins has done so much in 3 years to move us to a more equal justice in the Commonwealth. And I think decidedly I am the candidate who will continue that legacy and continue to do that work.
And is the suggestion that Kevin Hayden doesn't care, in your estimation, about these racial disparities that you're describing as much as you do?
I wouldn't say that he doesn't care. I would say that this matters about policies. My life has been dedicated to systemic justice. I understand that to change systems, it requires having policies and implementation. And frankly, I would say that I have planned out policies. I actually have policies on the table to continue that work, but I also am the only candidate in this race who's unequivocally stated that I support the policies Rachel Rollins has put in place and that I will not disrupt those.
And when you say the policies of Rachel Rollins, most viewers, the first thing that comes to mind are the 15 lower level criminal offenses that she said she would not prosecute. I assume you're referencing that. But when I asked interim DA Hayden about that, he said he believes deeply in diversionary programs and will probably be doing much of the same thing, even though he wouldn't formally give a stamp of approval as such to her specific program. That's not enough.
No, that's definitely not enough. Here's the deal. There are 13 courts at any given time, including the Supreme Judicial Court and the Appellate Court that the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office is operating in. Unless you have written policies like Rachel Rollins did here with the 15, and I am in fact referencing the 15 do not charge list. I actually helped create that do not charge list. I was one of the people at the table when that was created. What we talk about that allows us to have policies that ADAs, assistant district attorneys in those courtrooms, can then base their decision-making on. It's not what my decision-making is on, because I can't be in every single one of those courtrooms as the district attorney, neither can he. And so when he says that he's not going to have a written list or a written discharge list, but rather he'll look at each case by case, the reality is we get 20 to 25,000 cases in the Commonwealth and specifically in Suffolk County, you need written policies to address that. I'm the only one who's pledged to continue.
But to be clear, I don't want to beat this too long, but one last thing. Rachel Rollins herself told me when she was DA, it was a rebuttable presumption. It was not an absolute. In fact, some of those 15 crimes were prosecuted under her.
In fact, 1 in 4. And so the reality is the process, and again, this goes back to the written format, you had to go to a supervising ADA or a chief of that district court and say, hey, I think this is worthy of breaking from this list. And so without the list, you don't have that built in.
Counselor, the other night when Kevin Hayden was here, he mentioned something called a rapid indictment program he's initiating, add resources so that gun crimes can be expedited. Do you support that initiative?
Of course, but the reality is the rapid indictment process deals with cases that have already been brought before the courts. So what I am actually proposing is a task force that's focused on non-fatal shootings. Right now, we have clearance rates in the past 5 years that can go anywhere from 4% to 17% on non-fatal shootings. The Department of Justice did a study using the Boston Police Department's data and found that non-fatal shootings, as you would guess, lead to fatal shootings. And we should focus more resources on solving those and putting that together. I believe we can put a task force together at the district attorney's office to do that, and I seek to do that.
The gang database is very controversial. Kevin Hayden said that he would like it to be much more narrowly tailored. You want to dump it. There are some, not the two of you, but some who, well, maybe Kevin Hayden says, but I've heard others as say it's got to be narrowed, but it's helped solve murders. You don't buy that.
BPD hasn't told me that. So just to be clear, we've had this is not a new issue for me. For several years, I've been going up against the gang database just to prove if it's effective or not. It takes incredible resources, both in dollar amount and in human resources. Our police officers are surveilling nonviolent crime. Frankly, not surveilling crime at all. They're watching people play basketball and they're deciding or with who they play with or who they see at school. The federal appellate court came back with a decision on this that said that, frankly, that took the gang task force, the gang database to task and essentially said it was indiscriminate. And I have said the same. And so the issue with this list is that in the last year, they added under 100 names. The problem is that list has 3,500 names on it using the old format for putting these names on there. And you can't have focused deterrence with a non-focused list. And frankly, there's some real questions to civil liberties. There's some real questions in the way that this has collateral consequences in immigration court. And so I do not support the gang database. No.
You know,
and when I did ask, just to touch the point you brought up, we did ask BPD directly. We had the Boston Regional Intelligence Center before the City Council in March of last year. We asked them directly, can you trace the gang database to solving or preventing any crime? And the answer was no.
You mentioned Rachel Rollins. I would argue that at least as significant action from her time was her Integrity Review Bureau that led to the release of men, almost exclusively of color, who had spent more than 20 years in jail. The most recent initiation was the Stephen Pina case, 28 years in jail. The judge, when he ordered a hearing on the question of a new trial, said there had been prosecutorial and police misconduct. When I asked Kevin Hayden about whether he'd agree to Mr. Pina's request for a new trial, he said he wanted to hear back from his Integrity Review Bureau to see what their conclusion was. Would you, as DA, consent to a new trial for Mr. Pina?
Yes, and I've already come out the day that came out, that the decision was made by the judge to release Mr. Pina, who is now at home. I would have assented to that new trial. I would do that now. And I think one of the things that's gone unsaid on this is that the judge made it very clear that there was prosecutorial misconduct in this case, that there might have been even some police misconduct in this case in the way that evidence was handled. One of the things that I have seen frequently is that when we have these cases, we talk about Mr. Pina and obviously how great it is that somebody who has done time, undeservedly so, is being released. But what we don't talk about is accountability for the prosecutors and the officers who led to that wrongful prosecution in the first place. And so in that wrongful conviction. And so I would like to see action on that. I would like to see folks referred to the bar if they have, in fact, perpetrated fraud on Mr. Pina in terms of how they conducted their Brady discovery.
Ricardo Arroyo, I literally have 20 seconds left. There was a story in the Globe this morning about anti-vaxxers demonstrating at your mother's house. Even if people don't support Mayor Wu's change that would limit such demonstrations in neighborhoods from 9 to 9, they surely, I assume, would support it when it's directed at somebody's mother. Your colleague, though, Julia Mejia, said, I'm concerned about the unequal enforcement of this ordinance on organizers of color. Quickly, tell me why she's wrong.
I think one of the things that we got to look at here is that if the Boston Police Department wants to unequally enforce a law, there's several on the books that can do that right now. They could have done that with noise ordinances. They could do that with disorderly conducts. There's a number of different laws in which they could do that. They don't need this one to do that. The reality is this allows people to protest from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. That's 12 hours out of a 24-hour day if they wanted to do it in a public setting. And frankly, nobody's parents or family members should be targeted. And I'm grateful for the outcry that stirred when they went after my mother. But this law to me is narrowly tailored and allows people to continue to do what it is they seek to do, but allows at least some grace for neighbors in the early morning hours.
Ricardo Arroyo, I really appreciate your time. Good luck. Hope to see you a lot in the coming months. Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
This past Wednesday marked 1 year since a gunman shot and killed 8 people at 3 different spas in and around Atlanta. 6 of the victims were women of Asian descent. And although the shooter claimed his actions were not racially motivated, in the year plus since, attacks against Asian Americans skyrocketed, thanks at least in part to pronouncements like this.
I would like to begin by announcing some important developments in our war against the Chinese virus. It's not racist at all, no.
Not racist at all. But as a recent Boston Globe op-ed notes, even as these attacks have continued, Asian communities have persevered and rallied. Here in Massachusetts, Boston elected its first Asian American mayor. 8 state house members identify as Asian American or Pacific Islander, the most in the governing body's history. But according to the authors of that op-ed, we can and should be doing much more. I'm joined by State Representative Tram Nguyen, who co-authored that op-ed, along with Leverett Wing. He's the president and CEO of the Commonwealth Seminar, who also joins us, and Northeastern University Chief of Staff Stephen Chen. Representative Leverett, it's good to see you both. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us, Jim.
Representative, starting with you, I think everybody watching knows hate crimes are up, particularly against Asian Americans. But they're not just up. It is astronomical increases. Are they not?
Absolutely. And we're seeing increases across the country as well as here in the Commonwealth, but it's not just against it's not just against the Asian American community, but we're seeing hate crimes increase overall. And that is very alarming for all of us.
But in terms of Asian Americans, I think I read that, 350% increase in a year in New York City, more than 500% in San Francisco. And Representative, the primary victims of these attacks are women. Am I not right about that?
Absolutely. And seniors, too, unfortunately, the most vulnerable in our communities.
You know, on that note, the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum put out these statistics that are just jaw-dropping. 74% of AAPI women have experienced racism, discrimination in the past year. Have you, Representative?
I have not been a victim of a hate crime, but I have been a victim of hate speech. I think many of us, particularly in the AAPI community, are far too familiar with the rhetoric of us being perpetual foreigners. You don't belong here. I remember an incident a couple of years ago when I was in front of the courthouse, right, in Suffolk County. And I was standing out there with a client of mine and trying to explain to her, she's a new immigrant. I was explaining the law to her in Vietnamese, and this biker rode by and said, "Go back to your own country. You don't belong here." That is just one of many incidents that have happened to me, and I'm sure to many others.
And Leverett, I was right when I said that this is mostly, that portion that's directed at Asian Americans is a product of Trump drumming up this animus over COVID. That is the genesis of a lot of this, is it not?
I mean, for the COVID violence and the COVID hate, but I mean, we have to remember that these types of things have been perpetrated against the Asian American communities for generations, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then moving on sort of the high profile ones, the Japanese internment. I mean, when folks are looking for a scapegoat, when folks are looking for somebody to blame, that the Asian American community has been unfortunately front and center with a lot of these. So what this was just another example of the AAPI community being targeted for scapegoating.
You know, Leverett, when you say the Asian American community has been front and center, there are obviously many other communities of color that have faced serious discrimination and hate through years in this country. You're doing a lot of the outreach to other communities of color, other advocacy groups, and it appears, at least to me from your op-ed, that you're getting a pretty good reception. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, that's been one of the few silver linings to all this. I mean, we've been able to create better, more allyships, stronger allyships, more understanding, more commonality, because these are things that we've been going through together with George Floyd, with Ahmaud Arbery, with many of these things. Our communities, our diverse communities, have been able to come together in a way that I've been doing this for many years in a way that I haven't seen ever. And so that's something, again, that's a small silver lining to this, but it is a substantial one.
You know, Representative, you both, the three of you in your op-ed talk about solutions, not just problems. You mentioned at the Boston Foundation something called the Asian Business Empowerment Council is helping Asian American-owned businesses particularly hurt by the pandemic. I want to focus on the legislation, though, that I know you're involved in. You guys cite New York State, California. I was unaware of either of these efforts. Serious public money being directed at the Asian American community. You also think that there needs to be reform of hate crime statutes in the state. To what end? To do what?
So Leverett brought up the Ahmaud Arbery case, and actually that was an impetus for the hate crimes bill that we have pending in the legislature right now. We started working on this bill about a year ago during the anniversary of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, and we did a deep dive into our own laws to see if that were to happen here in Massachusetts, would we be able to hold perpetrators accountable? And we started working with the Attorney General's office as well as Senator Hines to do a deep dive into our laws to see where there are gaps. And certainly we identified certain gaps. Our laws are vague and overlapping, which means that prosecutors and judges lack clarity and have a disincentive to pursue hate crimes. And so we decided to add in various protected classes to be more inclusive. And we also dealt with the issue of mixed motivation, as you mentioned in the beginning, when, for the example of the Atlanta shootings, where the perpetrator said, well, I had a bad day, I had a sex addiction, but it was no coincidence that 6 out of the 8 victims were women of Asian descent. And so in our laws, we wanted to clarify that if a crime is committed in whole or in part based on hate towards a particular protected class, we should be able to pursue that as a hate crime. Hate does not need to be the single motivating factor in order for us to do that.
Leverett, I only have a minute left, but there's one other thing on your solutions list I thought was really important, is initiating more diverse curriculum in the schools. Briefly tell us what that would mean.
I think it's more inclusive, as you mentioned, it's more inclusive. It's a wider net. It educates everybody about all of us. I mean, people talk about ethnic history, ethnic studies. We've been learning ethnic studies for years. It's just what ethnicity have we been learning? I mean, I learned that Columbus discovered America. That the Wimmer Schoolhouse Rock, there was that cute little line about the manifest destiny, which made the massacre of Native Americans sound so cute and innocent. But it's just, all we're trying to do is make it more inclusive so that all of our stories are told and all of our histories are told so that we learn more about each other and that we can see our commonalities.
I wish you a great success in your work. Congratulations so far, Representative Nguyen, Leverett. I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Great.
Thanks so much for having us. It's great to be here with my friend Leverett.
That's great.
Yep, same here, Representative.
That's it for tonight. Rhode Island Congressman David Cicilline is here tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Please stay safe.